Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about this fight that I found very particularly interesting. And I did not even know that this fight was happening today until today. I heard that this fight was going to happen eventually sometime, but did not necessarily know that it was this weekend. And I did not really put a fight prediction out there, even though my fight prediction, of course, would have been that Danny Jacobs would have won this fight because, of course, his opponents overall, I believe, in this WBA belt eliminator, type of bout, I believe all in all that his opponent was the British fighter known as John Ryder. And of course, for those of you all in all that did not hear the news, Danny Jacobs actually ended up suffering the fourth loss in his career in this fight by split decision. And of course, there's a certain amount of people, claiming that it was a very controversial decision, that it was a big robbery, yada, 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 yada. I did just recently watch the fight myself. I didn't watch it live when it happened, but I watched it, I think, about an hour or two after the result had happened. And of course, I actually was very decently surprised that Danny Jacobs, all in all, did end up losing this decision. And I'm going to talk about who, in my personal opinion, I thought won the fight and what the fight should have been scored. Do I think that it was a bad decision or not? And keep in mind, I'm not a person that, alleges robbery, at every time. I'm not a person that does that. And what I'll say is this. I'm also not going to do that here today. And a lot of people, they may be surprised. They may think, all in all, they may disagree with me. But do I think that John Ryder getting the decision over Danny Jacobs was a robbery? No, personally, I do not. When I watched this fight, I actually thought that it was very decently competitive. And actually, to be quite honest with you, and this is just my personal opinion, and I have a record all in all as usually being a very decent scorer. I'm not someone that scores, things usually so unrealistically. When I took a look at this fight, Danny Jacobs, in my opinion, was throwing more than that of John Ryder, than, that of his opponent. But I actually think that John Ryder, the majority of the time, was actually landing the clearer and the cleaner shots. It just is what it is. Listen, once upon a time, Danny Jacobs, I think that he was one of the top contenders within the middleweight slash maybe 168-pound divisions, but mainly within 160 because he never really overall had that great of a win at 168. The last big win of his career was, of course, against Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., if you even want to consider that a big win at that point in time in his career. Danny Jacobs, when it comes down to it, he's almost like a dog when it comes down to it, or a cat or a pet overall that they're still around, but you can tell all in all that they're starting to get a little bit slower. They're starting to get a little bit grayer. They don't necessarily have the same speed. You can't take your dog for as long as a walk anymore because they're starting to run out of breath a little bit. So they basically can't do the same things that they used to do. Now, I'm not necessarily sure how old Danny Jacobs is, but the reason why I compare it to it like that is because you can tell that Danny Jacobs, that he is starting to lose a couple of steps. It just is what it is. And I seen this all in all, in the last fight against Gabriel Rosado, because that was another split decision fight that Danny Jacobs ended up getting out overall in that fight. He ended up winning that fight, but to be honest with you, and me and both my father, we watched that because we've known of Gabriel Rosado for a very, very long time. Gabriel Rosado has pretty much been on the radar. He's been almost kind of a fan favorite to watch for a very long time. Gabriel Rosado was never going to be a legitimate champion, but what Gabriel Rosado does show is he does show some sort of skills, at least on the C grade level, and he's a person all in all that gives it his all, and he's very, very tough when it comes down to it. So that's why Gabriel Rosado is usually a very interesting watch. To be honest with you, when both me and my father watched that fight, we thought that Danny Jacobs was lucky to even escape with that decision. And obviously, we were not the only ones that thought that because, of course, the judges, when it came down to it, they personally, or at least one of them, thought that Gabriel Rosado ended up winning that fight. Well, in this case, and in this turn, it ended up being John Ryder getting the fight over Danny Jacobs. Danny Jacobs, in my opinion, when you just talk about him as a boxer, he's never really been a boxing purist. And what I mean by that is that when you take a look at Danny Jacobs, I don't think all in all, if I were to recommend certain highlights if you were getting into boxing and, going to learn overall about how to counter and, just be overall the best technician that you possibly can be. I don't think that I would really usually recommend Danny Jacobs' highlights or his fights. It's not that he's a bad boxer. He's not a bad boxer. He can box. He doesn't have the worst feet that I've seen, and he doesn't have the worst head movement. It's not that he can't be some, a little bit slick, but he's slick in the same sense almost to the degree to where Jamal Charlo is slick, to where there's some slick moments here and there, but you can tell that he's just not naturally gifted with it like a Floyd Mayweather Jr. was or like a Araceli Lara was. He's not those fighters. He's not the technician overall that those fighters were. He can't do the things overall that those fighters can be. He cannot be the fighters that those fighters could be. But at the end of the day, what made Danny Jacobs so successful and a multiple time, weight division champion, or at least a multiple time champion? The thing that made him a multiple time official champion is not only can he box a little bit, and not only at his peak was he an A-grade boxer, but he also was gifted with extreme athleticism. Danny Jacobs overall was decently fast, but not only was he fast, his power was on the A-grade level. I remember when he fought Gennady Triple G Golovkin in that fight, all in all, and Gennady Golovkin the whole entire time, he was very, very worried about possibly getting hit with a punch. And Gennady Golovkin is a person where basically at the time, he was looked at as the boogeyman and the hardest puncher in basically all of boxing. And Gennady Golovkin at that time probably was. It just is what it is. Gennady Golovkin, for those of you that don't know, of course, for certain people that have sparred him, there's been certain people overall that says that he can punch overall like a light heavyweight. Some may even say heavyweights. Gennady Golovkin was that hard of a hitter. So at the end of the day, Gennady Golovkin ended up getting that victory. But what I'll say about Danny Jacobs is this. Like I said, I don't think Danny Jacobs has ever necessarily been a boxing purist, but I do think that once upon a time, he certainly was better than this. And it's very clear to me that within his past couple of fights, I don't think that he's really ever been the same ever since that Canelo Alvarez fight. I think that, of course, he ended up suffering that second loss in his career, that slight decision loss overall to Gennady Triple G Golovkin. But he still looked very, very competitive after those fights. And then the last competitive fight, of course, that he was in against a decent boxer was against Saul Canelo Alvarez. But ever since then, for whatever reason, and I think I know why the reason is, because of how technical and how good Canelo Alvarez can be, and not only that, but the power and a certain amount of other things, it almost kind of messes with you mentally. Sometimes losing by decision, but getting completely out, technical when it comes down to it, or basically out techniqued. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like Danny Jacobs was not competitive in the Canelo Alvarez fight. I thought that it was about 8 rounds to 4, maybe even 7 rounds to 5 in favor of Canelo, so it was a close competitive fight. But I think when Danny Jacobs got in that fight with Canelo, I think all in all that he realized that Canelo was just a much better technical fighter than what he even first realized. And Danny Jacobs, he just has not been the same mentally or physically after that fight. And I know a lot of people, like I said, they call this a robbery. I will have to watch the fight once again to really, tell you my official decision. But personally, I scored this fight a draw. I had Danny Jacobs winning the first 3 rounds. And to be honest with you, I thought that I was even a little bit generous. And I had Danny Jacobs also clearly winning the last 3 rounds. I thought that the last 3 rounds were the most clear for Danny Jacobs throughout the whole entire fight. I thought that he clearly was more active. But I think from round 4 all the way to round 9, I'm pretty sure I scored every single one of those rounds for John Ryder. There was multiple times that John Ryder was able to land more accurately. There's even a few times that he was able to hurt Danny Jacobs at the end of the round where he clearly had to get those rounds. It just is what it is. Like I said, in my opinion, I don't think that Danny Jacobs has ever been a boxing technician per se, but he is a person all in all that in my opinion should have done better than this. But let me give credit to John Ryder. Because John Ryder, what I will say is this, and I know a certain amount of people are going to laugh at me when I state this, but what he really overall reminded me in this fight, he almost reminded me of Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker if Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker had almost nowhere near the same amount of talent. That's what he really reminded me of. But if you actually take a look at John Ryder in this fight, when you usually take a look at a certain amount of British fighters, they're not usually overtly talented, or at least not to the upteenth degree. They usually can be very, very stiff. They don't usually have the best of feet. They certainly don't usually have the best of head movement. And John Ryder, I think, caught Danny Jacobs a little bit by surprise. Maybe there's a possibility that Danny Jacobs did not really know who he was getting into the ring with here. And he got caught with a hell of a lot more punches, I think, than what he truly desired to get hit by. It just is what it is. And Danny Jacobs also is a person to where he's not really that great of a counter puncher. He's a person to where he throws in a great amount of volume. He's a person all in all that throws, a great amount at certain times when he needs to. But at the end of the day, like I said, Danny Jacobs, he's not really known as a boxing purist. Danny Jacobs and Jamal Charlo, in my opinion, they're on a very similar level, in my opinion. But at the end of the day, I probably would even have to have Jamal Charlo, just in terms of technique, slightly above that of a Danny Jacobs. Do I think that Jamal Charlo would do better against Canelo than overall what Danny Jacobs did? No, I don't. Especially at this point in time in his career. But you never know. But what I will say is this. Danny Jacobs, like I said, I think once upon a time he was a very decent fighter, but it's now pretty much, time for him to hang it up. I don't really know how old he is. I'm guessing he's about maybe 33, 34 years old. But you can tell that Danny Jacobs, that he's just not the same fighter mentally. The physicality and somewhat of the strength and somewhat of that seems to be there. Could it have also been maybe that this guy was a little bit stronger than what he expected because, he doesn't look very, very big. John Ryder, I believe, is about 5'9", and that's somewhat pretty, small for the division. Canelo's about 5'9". And speaking of Canelo, John Ryder may face Canelo Alvarez a little bit later on now, because apparently he may be his mandatory for the WBA title. And I don't think that John Ryder, all in all, would have overall a tremendous chance over Canelo Alvarez. But what I do think is that it would be a decent tune-up fight for Canelo, maybe in between fights. And John Ryder, in my opinion, what I always say is this: I don't know really where to rank him on the B or C grade level. He does have 5 losses in his career, but he actually looked very, very good in this fight. Like I said, he almost reminded me of like Pernell Sweepy Whitaker, as if Pernell Sweepy Whitaker was nowhere near as talented as what he was in his prime. Because if you actually take a look at John Ryder here, he was coming forward, he was moving his head quite often, he was sticking the jab in his face when it came down to it, he was getting a lot of decent shots on the inside. He was more accurate with the jab, in my opinion, than what Danny Jacobs was. He caught him a certain amount of the times with the left hand. He was getting uppercuts on the inside. It just is what it is. I know a certain amount of people, they may disagree with me on that, but it just is what it is. John Ryder, I think that he surprised Danny Jacobs, all in all, overall, by being a little bit better than what he once originally thought him to be. And I think, to be honest with you, I think that's what caused Danny Jacobs to fight. It just is what it is. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Let me know overall what you guys thought on the fight. I personally thought that it could have went either way, but I can't disagree with the decision. And if you're asking me personally, actually, who I would have given the fight to between Danny Jacobs and John Ryder, it probably would have been John Ryder. But I would have to rewatch the fight. We'll see what happens. Of course, I'm not always correct on my assessments. At least, sometimes when I rewatch them, I may think a little bit differently. So we'll see. But right now, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So we'll see what happens. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you all later.